Thanks, everybody. So welcome to this session of using BioFinder for land use planning. If you've just tuned in, it's Andy Wood speaking here, a conservation planning specialist. I've got Jens Hilke joining us later, and together we are the Community Wildlife Program at Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. We're really thrilled to be here sharing this resource, BioFinder, with you that'll ultimately make decisions about land use planning that will ultimately benefit wildlife and their habitats. And we designed this training to be geared towards folks serving on town boards, such as conservation commissions, planning commissions, select boards, or planning departments. And today we're really focused on land use planning for natural resources. That said, if you're not part of one of those groups, we're still glad to have you here. And briefly, I'll mention that we ran 2 sessions of a related training called Intro to BioFinder. So if you're looking for more resources along this line, I can share information about how to access the recordings from those sessions. A couple housekeeping notes here. You've already passed the first test by making it into this virtual workshop using Microsoft Teams. And it's pretty similar to these other video platforms that we're all becoming familiar with. Your control panel should look something like this, and it should give you options to turn your video and microphone on and off. And most everybody should have a chat function that'll allow you to type in questions or clarifications throughout. We've been hearing that a couple folks don't have a chat function, and if that's the case, don't worry about it. You can unmute your microphone and ask a question during the question breaks. But just know that you'll want to type your message into the little box here and make sure you hit this paper airplane to send it to us. As I said, we'll pause periodically for questions and give you a little preview of what's coming up next in the presentation. So just a little bit of introduction about who we are. As we mentioned, we work for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and we believe in the conservation of our fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. And many people are surprised to learn that that mission includes the conservation of all wild living things, from bugs to bobcats, muskies to maples, as well as the natural communities and habitats they require to thrive. And we also serve all Vermonters, from hunters and anglers to people who just like to look at wildlife from a distance. Jens and I work closely with towns and communities, and there are other folks in our department who provide direct assistance to landowners looking to improve habitat on their property. And we all take our commitment to future generations seriously. We're here to ensure that the healthy and thriving wildlife and wild places that we enjoy will still be here for our kids and our grandkids. As staff for the Community Wildlife Program, we're available to help with the planning process that many of you are involved in. We're doing that now through virtual online presentations, but we're here to support all aspects of community level planning. We can help you analyze different data sets, connect to the communities around you, and really get a sense for the ecological context in which your community is situated. We also support the creation and interpretation of other resources. So at the end of the presentation, we'll point you towards 2 books that the department produced to help in this process. Again, if you need assistance in this, we're here to help you, so please reach out. Today, we're going to dive into the topic of land use planning through the lens of forests. And as Vermonters, these forests are all around us. And yet we know that the character and the quality of these forests is changing, and not all in good ways. So for all of you on the call, forests are a great place to begin thinking about land use planning in an ecological way. The healthier the forest is, the better for us and all the wildlife that live there. Today, we're going to be exploring specifically the benefits of large forests. Now, we know that not all forest is created equal, and these large forests offer a host of benefits that the smaller ones just can't offer in the same way. Those include supporting biological diversity, all of the species around us. They, of course, provide scenery. They help filter clean air and water and provide the working lands for the forest industry. It's just not operationally efficient to do a lot of forestry in a tiny woodlot. And of course, there are economic benefits to these large forests driven by the recreation and tourism economy. Going back to the ecosystem services, large forests help prevent erosion and reduce flooding. And they are the basis for many of our favorite activities, from hunting and fishing and wildlife viewing, and all of the money that's associated with those activities. There's research out there suggesting that large forests transmit fewer tick-borne illnesses, and in the age of climate change, especially important, they sequester carbon and other harmful gases. So these are just some of the many benefits of those large forests. And as I mentioned, these large forests power Vermont's economy. So this is not just ecology here we're talking about. This is an economic factor here for our state. We estimate that 12% of Vermont's GDP, or 20,000 jobs, rely on this. And the fall foliage tourism makes up a big chunk of the tourist income. Those hunting, fishing, and wildlife viewing contribute $685 million annually to Vermont. These intact wetlands and riparian areas associated with our forests reduce damage from floods. And these are just staggering numbers. The forest recreation and tourism provide $1.9 billion annually to Vermont's economy, and the forest products add $1.5 billion on top of that. You know, this year obviously is a little bit different, but you know, over the long haul, these forests are the engines to much of our economy here in this state. So when we talk about forests in the context of land use planning, we definitely need to include working forests in our thinking and in our definition. And so today, the focus is really going to be on keeping forests in mind and managing them for their ecological function. And what I mean by that is the ability of plants and animals to interact as needed in order to thrive, reproduce, migrate, and move even as the climate changes. So that's kind of the end goal of what we're after in thinking about large forests in the land use planning equation. Over time, the historical record of how we've managed our forests is a pretty fascinating thing to look at. So I'd like to share this example of one particular area in Vermont. This is in the Stowe Waterbury area. And let me just get my pointer here. This road here is Vermont Route 100. And we're going to be really focused on this block of forest here in the center of the image. So in 1962, these areas in green are all of the areas that we would classify as being forested. Now I want to draw your attention to a couple patterns here. Obviously, there's this big chunk here, but what's really important from an ecological perspective is that we still have a connection up to the north, or the top of this image, to this other forest block. And to some degree, you can hopscotch from east to west or right to left across these forests. We do recognize there's some fragmentation. There's a barrier to that connectivity here, and of course the road provides another barrier. But by and large, we have what we would consider you know, a connected block to these other areas. Now, if we fast forward into 1974, you can see that this road was built into the interior of the forest. And that's something that is especially problematic for trying to manage forests in this ecological way. By 1996, that pattern has really accelerated. So off of this first road, you can see a number of residential lots have been added in, and we have this whole other network here coming in from the north. There's also another residential network of development happening in here. By 2007, that pattern continues, and by 2011, we've largely lost that connection between this northern block here and the main block. And so what's really changed here is the pattern of that forest. Interestingly enough, there's more or less the same amount of overall forest. What was lost here to residential development in a way was replaced by some of these old fields turning into forest. But the character and the pattern of that forest has been dramatically altered. That east-west connection that was already starting to become fragmented by these roads is now much more tenuous. You know, wildlife passing through this area would need to take the long route. And this is a problem that's occurring all over Vermont. And if you look to the south in some of our neighboring states, this pattern of build out is very rapidly accelerating. And that pattern is coming to a community near you. And so, you know, the work that you do is so important now more than ever. Now, you might be wondering, what kind of effect does this have on the wildlife? Simply put, there is a strong relationship between the size of the forest and the diversity or number of species that live there. So in this slide here, what you see is I have 5 different forest block sizes ranging from the undeveloped large forest down to the smaller forest block that you might find in a neighborhood near you. And below each of these forest block sizes is a list of the species that you might expect to find in a habitat block of that size. So interesting to note, as you move from the undeveloped forest to this 500 to 2,500 acre block, you lose some of the large, wide-ranging mammal species like coyote and bobcat, black bear and fisher. You know, they might still pass through this block, but they're going to need more than what this area can provide by itself. Moving to the next smaller block, we start to lose some of our large raptors and other species. And then as you go, more and more of those species will drop out until when you get to this size block, all that's left are the songbirds that might have a relatively small territory or home range, or the species that have become highly adapted to living among humans, like raccoons, who are garbage can specialists. And so that pattern, you know, it's a generalization, but by and large, it's true. As you reduce the size of a forest block, wildlife that need those larger areas are going to need to travel among blocks to meet all their needs. So let's take a look at that area we were just looking at a few slides ago. That's this block down here. And so now we've zoomed out to the greater Stowe area. And think about your favorite charismatic wildlife species, whether that's bear, moose, otter, or bobcat, or take your pick. And think about how is it that these species are going to move across this landscape. The reality is it's fragmented here. And so these species are going to need to do that habitat hopscotch to get from one side of the landscape to the next. And so thinking about your community and what the pattern of development is there, think ahead to the future. And you know, we're trying to support the work to identify those habitats and retain and enhance what connectivity is remaining. Okay, so we'll pause here for questions. Jens, we got anything in the chat?
No, I took care of the question about tips.
Okay. Anybody else out there want to unmute their mic and ask a question?
Just a quick question. What's the best way to access aerial photos for individual towns so that they could demonstrate the same fragmentation over time?
There are a variety of resources. One of the resources that our program uses extensively is BioFinder, and there are options in there to access. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but a number of years of different imagery. And then if you go to Google Earth, they also have a function where you can go back in time through the available imagery and look at those patterns. And it will depend on what kind of imagery is available. But those are two starting places, and I'm sure that there are many, many more as this data becomes more common.
And this is Jens. I'll just add that the set you just saw, I scanned from the state archives in Middlesex. So they do have the 1940 flyover, the 1966, the 74, each of those that was shown. Those are in the state archives as well. So, I don't think any of the online sources will go back to the 1940 flyover, but I scanned those in person in the archives.
Thanks, Jens. Great question. Okay, I think we'll keep going, but if you have other thoughts on that, there'll be another break coming up in a little bit. So now that we've covered some of that ecological context for why these larger forest blocks matter, we're going to dive into how you take that concept and apply it to planning. So knowing how much the size of a forest block can matter, the Agency of Natural Resources created a map data set showing all of the undeveloped forest habitat blocks across Vermont. And what I mean by a forest/habitat block is simply areas of natural cover surrounded by roads and development. Since we knew that the smaller blocks generally offered less in terms of supporting biodiversity, we used that 20 acres as a cutoff. So everything in this data set that you see here on the right is 20 acres or larger. And in this map, those forest habitat blocks are classified by size. So the larger blocks are that deep dark red, and the smaller blocks are the oranges and yellows. And this provides a really useful pattern for looking at what kinds of forest habitat blocks are left in Vermont. You can see the spine of the Green Mountains here, some of these other mountain ranges, the Northfield Range and the Worcester Range, and of course the Northeast Kingdom is a bit of a stronghold in that regard. Down in the valleys, not surprisingly, our forest blocks are much smaller. I want to just point out here that for this purpose, we considered class 4 roads as features that didn't necessarily impede connectivity in this data set. So there are class 4 roads that crisscross much of this area, and we can talk about that during the Q&A if folks have questions there. So zooming back into our Stowe Waterbury area, if you turn on this map data set, which is available in the BioFinder, you'll see that to the west of Stowe is a 72,000 plus acre forest block. This is the Mount Mansfield State Forest Block. And that is a huge chunk of forest habitat. To the northwest of Stowe is this Madonna block, ringing in at about 32,000 acres. And they're mapped separately because they're divided here by a route. I think that's 108 there. I can't quite see, but that makes sense in my head. So, there is a dividing feature here that fragments some of the connectivity. But by and large, these two forest blocks operate together as an ecologically functional unit. And so together, we're looking at over 104,000 acres. That's a huge chunk of habitat. To the east is another large, important forest habitat block covering much of the Worcester Range. That's my local mountain range there. And that's about 45,000 acres. So for the land use planners in the Stowe Waterbury area, really the question is, can we maintain this connection and enhance the connectivity between these two areas? If the answer is yes, then we can collectively have a network of almost 150,000 acres. If we continue that pattern of development there, we're back down to 100,000 acres, which is good, but not nearly as good as 150,000. So this kind of thinking is so important in so many areas throughout the state. And we really want to emphasize this. And so to give you another example, here's another landscape. If I color in all of the areas that would meet that threshold to be counted as a forest habitat block, you'd see that we have a pretty good network here on the left of the image and another forest block up here in the right. This area in the middle didn't make the cut because this block by itself just wouldn't really be that ecologically meaningful alone. But it's going to play a critical role in this landscape in connecting these larger forest habitat blocks. And these three areas here, again, these are smaller, less ecologically functional by themselves, but those are our stepping stones that get you from the larger blocks to the medium-sized blocks back to the larger blocks. And we call these areas habitat connectors. So for a lot of communities, the reality is you'll probably have forest habitat blocks on the periphery of your community, and what's left within the town is really a connector. I'll also point out that here we have another avenue of connectivity, these connected waterways, this stream and this pond or wetland here. So that's really exciting because it's much more actionable. It gives you lots of places on the landscape where you can look at and begin to plan for connectivity. So you might be wondering, okay, do these smaller connections really make a difference? And the answer is a resounding yes. So this slide up here that I'm showing you is an example for how a smaller habitat feature can play a big role for a species like bobcat. So a number of years ago, the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department was involved in a research project where bobcats were captured and collared with tracking collars. And the collar would beam a location every 20 minutes during the sort of dawn and dusk and evening hours. And so each of these points represents a place where that bobcat was at some point during the evening or the hours close to it. Not surprisingly, it spent a lot of time in these forest and wetland habitats. But you may have noticed this cool area here, this string of points where a bobcat crossed from this wetland and forest habitat area across, this is Route 116, over into this other large forest habitat block. So that's really exciting because just having this connecting feature of a hedgerow was enough to really enhance the function of this landscape. So there's the story that can give us all a little bit of hope. And again, this connectivity is important not just for bobcat and bear and moose. It's important for all kinds of other species. Some of you might be amphibian enthusiasts and know that connectivity matters to those species as well as they move from their upland to wetland habitats. And so, what we're really just looking at here in this slide is an example of a less connected landscape where there are large barriers to animal movement. And over here, we have a much better connected landscape where this core waterway feature provides habitat connectivity through the landscape. And then we have this vegetated area out here to this other little habitat island. So, think about your community, take a look at the patterns and see, hey, where might we be able to go from this to this? Or how do we keep this from turning into that? And it's not just important at the local level. What you do in your community or your area of influence will radiate beyond to the state level. So looking back at that map of Vermont, if we can enhance connectivity on the local level, we create this grid or network of pathways for wildlife to move from north to south, to east to west, into neighboring. Some of you might be aware of a partnership called the Staying Connected Initiative, and this is something that we're involved in, looking at these critical areas for habitat connectivity across the landscape. And this image is a little bit off, but the idea here is that Vermont is really at the crossroads for species that are moving up out of southern New England and dispersing into Maine and Canada. So it's not just north-south here, it's east-west. And of course, what you do at the local level will really matter to all of the species that are around you. So I like to just point that out, that all scales matter when it comes to connectivity. And that's it for my section. We'll pause here and take some questions and then transition over to Jens.
A question from Lauren. Can you speak to the potential for Class 3 wetlands to serve as important habitat connectors? It seems they're often left behind in conservation conversations and planning.
So good question. So Class 3 wetlands, there, for folks who aren't familiar with that, it is referring to a type of wetland as classified by the Vermont wetland rules. And I would say, really for wildlife, many of these wetlands can be providing pathways to move around the landscape. The bobcat don't care what classification the wetland is, although I would say that many of the Class 3 wetlands tend to be smaller and perhaps lower functioning. So, there is a question of habitat quality there. Not to say that, I guess it's a broad characterization to make, but wetlands are definitely extremely valuable habitats, and we should definitely take them into consideration regardless of what classification they might be.
Great, thanks, Andy. And Abby writes, she's in Connecticut and curious if there's any tools similar to BioFinder there.
I don't know much about Connecticut. Jens, do you?
I don't know of any tool like this in Connecticut. I mean, Massachusetts has BioFinder Map 2. All the states have wildlife action plans, but in terms of an online map with a conservation design, I don't think Connecticut has anything similar. Kathy just wrote in, similarly, can you speak, similar to the wetlands conversation, similarly, can you speak to river corridors and how they function as habitat connectors?
Great question. These river corridors, we often refer to them as riparian areas, are absolutely essential for so many species. And many of our wildlife are specialists in that kind of habitat. So, today we are kind of taking you through it from a forest perspective, but we could have just as easily designed a presentation around focusing on those riparian habitats. And some folks, if you're in a community that doesn't have large forests, well, the riparian areas may be an equally productive avenue to take this concept and apply it. So you definitely keep those in mind. And I'll just add anecdotally that they're amazing places to view wildlife. So we know that they're using these habitats. And just the other day, I was out in a riparian area watching all the different warbler species. So you're right on. These are amazing places for wildlife. Great question. Any others?
Yeah, I have a question about the age of the forest block data. And then I have seen that there's some land cover data being updated soon. And I'm wondering whether Fish and Wildlife would then sort of update its forest block information.
That's a great question. I don't have the exact date at the tip of my tongue that was used to create this data set, but it is something that we are having conversations about, and trying to figure out which layers need to be updated first as the data becomes more accurate through time and reflects the more recent changes. So yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have good specifics for that, but we are trying to keep it updated as we are able and have the funds and the staff power to do so.
Yeah, Kevin, the habitat blocks are based on the 2011 CCAP Coastal Change Assessment Program data set. And that's like the NLCD is updated every 5 years. And yes, you're right. The Spatial Analysis Lab's new forest cover data set is much better. We've been having some issues with the forest block data set. It may have a 0.5 meter resolution, which is greater, resolution, but not greater accuracy. So we haven't yet created a similar forest block product using that LiDAR-based land cover data. So yes, that's where we want to head. And once we have those blocks, it'll be pretty easy to redo VCD using that new block delineation. But there are a few technical hurdles because of all the data in the LiDAR. They're so data rich. Anyway, sorry to to go nerd out for a second, but I thought Kevin might want to get into the weeds on that one.
Yep, thank you. That's great.
Okay, I'm hearing cricket, so I think we'll pass the baton to Jens, and Jens will also have some question breaks throughout his section.
All right, am I all set?
You're good to go, Jens.
All right, great. Well, thanks so much. So I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the planning side of things. And in 2018, the land use provisions from Act 171, a larger forest integrity bill, came online. So as of January 1st, 2018, there's a new land use planning goal, which is to manage Vermont's forest lands so as to maintain and improve forest blocks and habitat connectors. That is that requires both towns and regional plans. And I know there are a couple of regional planners on the line, some of whom are wrestling with their regional plans related to this. And it requires that both town plans and regional plans indicate those areas that are important as forest blocks and habitat connectors. For us, that word indicate really means map them and include in your town plan or regional map which blocks you want to maintain for forest blocks and connectors. And you need to plan for land development in those areas to minimize forest fragmentation and promote the health, viability, and ecological function of those forests. So in this next section, I'm going to get in a little bit more of the weeds on how we take this concept of forest blocks and connectors and really apply it in the town and regional planning world. My first piece of advice to you is to start with BioFinder. Andy will put this link in the chat, but it's biofinder.vermont.gov, and here's the map that you're seeing. And so when you first load BioFinder, it offers this snapshot of this landscape context by showing you in dark green the highest priority areas and in light green the priority areas. And so this is all of the priorities together mapped just as what's highest priority and priority. So what I'm going to do now is I want to explode this prioritized map into its component parts and show you how it was built and what those components look like. And then at the end, we'll bring it back to this overall prioritization. When you're doing your town and regional planning work, this map is a great first place to start. It's just figuring out what the priorities are at this statewide scale. But because you're not planning at a statewide scale, you're going to want to look at how these priorities were made, i.e. you want to explode your map into the component parts, and then look at the individual priorities, the parts of this map, one by one. And that's going to be more helpful to you at that town planning scale, is to see where these priorities came from. And then when we put it all back together, you'll have a richer understanding of what's going on. So Andy introduced this concept of the forest block, these areas of natural cover surrounded by roads and development. And he showed you this image before of the blocks coded by size, with the darkest blocks being bigger and the smallest blocks being smaller. And so this concept of the forest block is the starting place of the BioFinder website and the Vermont conservation design data that's shown on the BioFinder website. I'll just zoom into to an area in the Mad River Valley. Jim Edgecombe, this is for you, and you'll see this pattern of these large forest blocks here in the Camel's Hump block, and then actually let me just change my pointer. So here in the Camel's Hump block, and then the Northfield Range here along the side. And so you just by looking at this first snapshot, you can see all of these blocks, the largest ones, and then down closer to the Mad River, which comes through here, you'll see that there are smaller blocks. And that's a really similar pattern most everywhere in Vermont. Larger blocks up on the hills, smaller blocks as you get down into the valley. The issue is that there's actually a lot more life. There's more biological diversity at lower elevation than there is at higher elevation. So we need those large blocks to allow for our far-ranging mammal species, to allow for climate change adaptation, i.e. species moving around on the landscape. But we actually have more biological diversity lower in the valley. So anyway, let me just take this concept the next step. So here is one of the components of Vermont conservation design that you'll see on the BioFinder website. It's called interior forest. And these are the deep, dark woods. You get deep forest species here that you don't get elsewhere. You get ecological processes that you don't find in smaller forests. And so interior forest, that component, is a selection of all of those habitat blocks. So in the last image I showed you, there are 4,052 forest blocks in Vermont statewide. Interior forest is a selection of about 900 of those. And it's a different selection along the spine of the Greens than it is in the Champlain Valley or the Connecticut Valley or the Piedmont. So there are different size thresholds in these different biophysical regions, because again, there's going to be more biological diversity at lower elevation. So that Champlain Valley block, the blocks in the Champlain Valley, even smaller blocks are going to have a lot more biological diversity than their size compared to the big blocks along the spine of the Greens. So I'm just trying to give you a sense of how this data set was created, done differently for each biophysical region. It's a selection of the overall forest blocks. I'll zoom into the Mad River Valley again. And here you see, I want to use Waitsfield as the example today here. And you see that large Camel's Hump block is selected, and just the tip of it goes into Waitsfield. And it was selected as a highest priority interior forest block. So that tells Waitsfield that, from this statewide perspective, even that little tip of forest is a big deal because it's part of something much bigger. Also, the whole Northfield Range in Waitsfield is considered a priority forest block. So we know it's important for the overall network of interior forests in Vermont. We don't have enough information to know that one interior forest block is better than another with respect to the priority ones. So we just have labeled them all priority. Whereas these largest blocks, that we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that they are instrumentally important as interior forest for those interior forest conditions. So I'll come back to that prioritization in a second, but so this is just one component. And so if you're making an Act 171 map for the town of Waitsfield, you know, this looking at these priorities one by one. So first you start with that dark green map of the overall priorities, and then you go component by component. So this is our first one, and we've seen, you know, the Camel's Hump block and the Northfield range as important for Waitsfield. And then a little bit of the block right here. Just a bit of that block, that 3,000 acre block goes into Waitsfield. Okay. So the next component in Vermont conservation design on the BioFinder website is called connectivity blocks. And this is another subset of the overall forest blocks. And the astute observer will notice that many of these blocks are exactly the same as the interior forest blocks, but not all of them. This, the selection of blocks for connectivity blocks, actually is a connected pattern, north to south, east to west. These are the lands in Vermont that allow for wildlife movement from the Berkshires and the Taconics in the south, up to the Sutton Mountains of Quebec in the north, the White Mountains in New Hampshire, over to the Adirondacks. These are the connected forests in Vermont that allow for that pattern of regional movement. Again, let's zoom into Waitsfield, and you can see that, yes, again, that same Camel's Hump block shows up as highest priority from a connectivity perspective for Waitsfield. You'll see that from the connectivity perspective, the Northfield range now shows up as highest priority. And there are not too many roads that cut across the Northfield range. And so there's a great deal of potential for north-south movement in that Northfield range. So it makes sense that that was elevated to the concept, to that level of highest priority. That same block shows up as priority. The one here where my laser is shows up as priority from the connectivity perspective. So again, we know it's playing a supportive role in allowing connectivity in this general area, but there isn't, you know, there isn't enough to say that this block is particularly better than that block or that block. So they all get called just priority from this perspective. I did just want to point out this spot for you. Look how close together those two highest priority connectivity blocks get in Waitsfield. So you don't, you know, really what we're looking for is where do the blocks get close together? And that's where we're going to have these potential for wildlife movement between these larger blocks. These are the spots where populations are going to be able to exchange, you know, individuals. So that spot in Waitsfield is of real interest to me, and I'm going to continue to flag that for you over the next few examples. Okay, so let me just show you these two priorities together. This is the interior forest and the connectivity blocks on the same map. And so I'm showing you the highest priority interior forest. It's also, that's on top. That's also a highest priority connectivity block. Then you see the Northfield range as a highest priority connectivity block. And then you see that these three get flagged as priority for connectivity. Okay. So as we're working on this imaginary first draft of an Act 171 map for Waitsfield, you might start with those two highest priority blocks, and then you might add in those other three priority blocks from the connectivity perspective. And so maybe your first draft of that Waitsfield Act 171 map would look something like this. Now I'm going to add in habitat connectors in the next section. But I just wanted to start with those two general concepts of how do you move from that statewide highest priority perspective to a more local, what's important in my town kind of perspective. So with that, let's just pause. Any questions that have come up so far for folks? Feel free to unmute your mics.
Kathy asks, is there a deadline for when forest blocks need to be added to regional and town plans?
No, it's just when your town plan is next up for renewal. So they're on 8-year cycles. So you know, if your town plan was just updated in 2017, you still have quite a while before the Act 171 provisions. You'll be responsible for incorporating those into your town planning.
That's all we have in the chat so far.
Anyone else? All right. Feel free to write into the chat and I'll grab it at the next break. Okay, so Andy talked about this image as well, and I just wanted to review that with you. Remember this. Andy called it a stepping stone. It's still a forest block, but it's a type of connector. So in that Waitsfield example, we showed you those highest priority interior forests and those highest priority connectivity blocks. Those are really these anchor blocks here, right? But we need to fill in that network to allow for these stepping stones between the larger forest blocks. And then we're also going to fill it in with these micro connectors, these wildlife road crossings, and this network of riparian areas that knits the whole system together. So let's go back to Waitsfield. And I just wanted this is that same image I showed you before of the highest priority connectivity block, the highest priority interior forest and connectivity block up here, the highest priority connectivity blocks, and then the 3 priority blocks here. Let's just add in the surface water and riparian area network. And that's the Mad River. And you can see how it knits together these forest blocks. Now, the surface water and riparian area data set is based on a model that is pretty expansive. It pretty much includes everything in the floodplains, from where the elevation changes from a steep slope to a more gradual. This model is going to include everything in there on the flats as blue. So it's more expansive than the river corridor model. But we believe it's important for biological diversity, that all those places that accumulate water are important for biological diversity. And you can really see how it knits together these forest blocks. This allows for wildlife movement north to south through Waitsfield beside the Mad River, and also east to west. So you know, we talked a little bit about that riparian network at one of the question breaks. And I just want to reiterate, even here in Waitsfield, this incredibly forested town, that surface water and riparian area network is playing a huge role. So here's what it would look like in BioFinder with our selection. Again, I'm trying to build this model Act 171 map. And so you can see the selections of forest blocks, those highest priority ones, the priority ones, and now the surface water and riparian area. So, you know, from an Act 171 perspective, that surface waters and riparian areas may not get treated under forest protections. It may be protected through other mechanisms. A variety of towns have fluvial erosion hazard zones or overlay districts for surface waters. So you might protect your surface waters separately and not include it on your Act 171 map, but it's still integrally important into this overall network of connected lands and waters. So then there's one other micro connector that we talked about, and these are wildlife road crossings. Now, please know that these are the wildlife road crossings that are available on the BioFinder website. These are based on models using the structural characteristics on both sides of the road. And really by that, I mean, where there are trees and wetland habitat on both sides of the road. And so because it's a model, you know, it's pretty expansive, and it includes some connectors that I'm not convinced are viable. So the wildlife road crossings data set, in my opinion, is not suitable for immediately attaching it to a regulation, aside from a heightened level of review type of standard. But they are important to include in your town plan, and many towns will write in, you know, over the next 8 years, we want to get a better handle on our wildlife road crossings. What you see on the map are the list of potential wildlife road crossings, and in the next year, we're going to do more inventory to get to the bottom of that. Warren, the town just south of the example, has really been working on fine-tuning these wildlife road crossings through a series of inventories that they've contracted out for several years now. And so it's totally fine to simplify which wildlife road crossings you're including in this list of connectors. This is help that Andy and I can provide for you. You can hire consultants to do it. But you might want to limit the total number to the ones that are the most likely to be functional, and the ones between these important forest blocks. So it's okay to simplify those wildlife road crossings, and you just need to be careful with them because they are not field verified. They are based on models. And all of that information is going to be available to you in the component abstract. So I just wanted to switch gears quickly and just show you Ferrisburgh and how the highest priority interior forest and connectivity blocks in Ferrisburgh, a town there in the Champlain Valley and on the lake, those forest blocks are quite small compared to our last example in Waitsfield. I know there's a tremendous amount of biological diversity in Ferrisburgh in those small blocks, but they're really islands in a sea of agriculture. And so here I just put on that surface waters and riparian area network to just show you again how critically important this is for knitting these forest blocks together. Here are the connections for where all sorts of species will walk beside the water to connect in these forest blocks, or walk right in the water, or swim, or whatever it might be. So even if your forest blocks are quite small, you want to especially look at your surface waters and riparian area networks as a key connecting feature, and make sure that those type of connections also get the regulatory standards that they deserve. Okay, so then when we put this all together in BioFinder, again, this is that highest priority map. And so everything that you see in dark green is a priority for one reason or another. So I'll just zoom into Waitsfield, and you can see that that Camel's Hump block that I've been pointing to shows up as dark green because it's both an interior forest highest priority and a connectivity highest priority. You'll see that Northfield Range block shows up as highest priority because of the connectivity function. And then you'll also see this whole surface water and riparian area network showing up as highest priority. So I've shown you what the overall prioritization looks like, and then how to go one by one and look at the individual components. Here's the same map for Ferrisburgh, and again, you can see just how expansive that surface water network is. And so for Ferrisburgh planning, you might not want to include all of that modeled surface water network. You might want to focus on that which hasn't been developed or that which isn't in agriculture. So even within these more expansive layers, there are ways of parsing them apart to meet your planning objectives. Now, these priorities are based on this concept of ecological function. The ability of plants and animals to interact as needed in order to thrive, reproduce, migrate, and move, even as the climate changes. Any quick questions? I'm running a little bit late, but any questions? That's the more technical piece.
No questions in the chat.
Well, forgive me, I'm just going to blunder blindly forward and get in this last section, just being cognizant of the time. I apologize. So a lot of towns do have local inventories. And in the Mad River Valley, they have had a natural resource inventory conducted by Arrowwood Environmental in 2007. And I just want to stress that these sorts of inventories provide the best data for making decisions at the town scale. And so absolutely, you should be including, if you have an inventory, you should absolutely be including it in your town planning. And that's going to show you local priorities as well as the statewide priorities available on BioFinder. Here in the Mad River Valley, we were able to take the Arrowwood data from their inventory in 2008 and bring it into a map like this that really shows that's a map suitable for planning because it forced these heritage elements into different tiers. And the primary tier, primary conservation area, would have the highest regulatory standard. Thou shalt not touch. These are the most sensitive areas. Whereas the secondary conservation area, you can allow for a little bit more development in there without sacrificing the functions and values of that location. Whereas the tertiary area, it's really just a large forest block, and you can allow for even more development there. So I'm just showing you how you would take a map like, excuse me, how you would take an inventory and bring it into a map that's really appropriate for planning at the town scale. Another thing is this concept of community values mapping. And community values mapping, we would take, we do this sort of work a lot, and we get as many people from the town in the room as possible. We have them cluster around base maps, and they draw, what do they love about living in this town? And they draw different areas. I love the quiet here. I love the economic viability of the forestry there. I love the community feel of the town tavern, whatever it might be. And so here's a map of community values from Richmond, Bolton, Jericho, and Huntington. And darker areas show more overlapping values, and lighter areas show fewer. And so here's that same map for the Mad River Valley with the community values underneath, and then the overlapping forest blocks on top. And so I'm just using this to show you how much overlap there is here between those community values, what people care about, and those big blocks of habitat that are so important for biological diversity. So you can take those social values and add those ecological values to produce, a conservation priorities map that would be most appropriate in the future land use section of what you want your town to look like. So, in closing, we know all of this is a balancing act, and we're planning for all sorts of different things. But those healthy forests are going to lead to and are already part of that healthy economy and the healthy communities that we're planning for. So this balancing act, those ecological resources are a huge part of that balancing act. Andy mentioned at the beginning that we have a couple books available to you. These are both PDFs available on our website. I have a few more paper copies of Mapping Vermont's Natural Heritage that I can send out. But those are two great resources that you should check out. Feel free to email us. Our services are available to towns and RPCs for free. We're really happy to get involved. And then lastly, I just wanted to remind you that you can help support conservation in Vermont through the Vermont Habitat Stamp and the Non-Game Fund. It's overwhelmingly, at the moment, it's overwhelmingly hunters, anglers, and trappers that pay for conservation in Vermont. And so everyone benefits from it. And so this is a way that you can help support it. Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. Any questions that came up in those last couple sections? How are we doing?
Nothing in the chat so far, so we'll just open it up. Folks can unmute and ask directly.
I don't know if it worked.
Yeah, John, we're with you.
All right. Woo. So community values mapping, great idea. How do we try to carry that forward in these current times?
John, I was scheduled to do that all over your region this year.
Yep.
We canceled a bunch of them. I don't know. It's not an activity that lends itself to online.
No.
I really don't like doing it online. So I don't know. I don't know what that might look like. I think we really need to get creative with that.
Well, I wanted to just explore that thought with you because I can't imagine it would be nearly as good virtually as in person, but who knows when we can go back to in person. So
yeah, I hear you. Well, I'd love to talk that through with you and Margot.
Okay.
This is Lauren Sofer. I was just wondering if you could speak more to that process of involving the community, how you go about, translating their values to the map. Is it one-on-one interviews? Is it group meetings? Is it multiple meetings? I think it's so valuable to integrate that, and I'm psyched to see it.
Great. I guess I should caveat this with, these are pre-COVID slides.
Yes.
The way we have done it is we try and get as many people in the room as we possibly can. In Heinsberg, they called every third name on the grand list. And they said, if you're not going to come and represent your values, who is? And so they got a good turnout. In Cornwall, we made signs, and we did it in the elementary school the week before we did it for the grown-ups, and that was a way of getting it. So then the actual night of the event, you've got as many people from town as you possibly can. We have base maps with just roads and some basic features on them, some basic landmarks, but not property boundaries. We have these base maps and a set of markers and a facilitator, and we randomly break up the audience into small groups, 8 to 12, have them cluster around the map. The facilitator asks, what do you love about living here? They circle areas, not the whole town, but little areas. I love to hunt here. I love to mountain bike there. I love the quiet and the serenity of this area here. And they circle these areas. And then I take them and make rasters out of them, and I co-occur them. I overlap them. So I bring all the similar results from like anything that might be considered cultural or scenic. I put in one group. Anything that's hunting or fishing related, I might put in another group. And then I'll take those groups and I'll make all the blobs into bigger blobs. And then I overlap those blobs to produce the maps that I showed you. And so that would be a co-occurrence of community values. And then you could overlap that with ecological priorities, and that would show you potential allies in conservation efforts moving forward. Yeah, happy to talk with you more about it.
Yes, I would love that. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I think we should get going, but really appreciate it. Please don't hesitate to email us with follow-up questions, and we're really happy to help in any way that we can.